Picture the life on paper. A legendary drumming career, a marriage to one of the most photographed women on the planet, a newborn son, sold-out arenas waiting on the other side of every soundcheck. By any outward measure, Travis Barker has everything a person could want. And yet, turn 50 candles on his cake, and you're still looking at a man shaped by fire, literally. This is the story of how a kid from a small California town became one of rock's most recognizable drummers, and how a single night in September 2008 fractured his life into a before and an after that he has spent almost 2 decades trying to reconcile. To understand the tragedy of Travis Barker, we have to go back to the beginning, long before Blink-182, long before the Burns, long before he became, in his own words, someone who had to learn to live for the people who didn't get to. Travis Landon Barker was born on November 14, 1975, in Fontana, California, to Gloria and Randy Barker. Fontana was a working-class Inland Empire town, not exactly a hub for future rock stars, but it's where Barker's identity as a musician took root almost by accident. According to his own account in his 2015 memoir, Can I Say?, his mother Gloria bought him his first drum kit when he was 4 years old, and by 5 he was already taking formal lessons. He dabbled in almost everything else a restless kid might try: skateboarding, surfing, trumpet, piano, but he kept returning to the drums, as though something about hitting things in rhythm made sense to him in a way nothing else did. Gloria wasn't a passive bystander in this. She loved music herself and introduced her son to recordings by jazz drumming legends like Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa, sitting with him and absorbing the records together even though she had no formal musical training of her own. It's the kind of detail that sounds almost too neat in hindsight, a mother nicknaming her son her drummer boy and having him learn to play the little drummer boy on command. But that's the story Barker himself has told over and over in interviews and in his memoir, because that period of his childhood became inseparable from what came next. When Barker was still a young teenager, Gloria was diagnosed with Sjogren's syndrome, an autoimmune disorder that attacks the body's moisture-producing glands and, in more severe cases, can affect other organ systems. Her decline was fast. Barker has written about spending a summer shuttling to the hospital with his family, watching his mother grow weaker by the week. On September 3, 1990, Gloria died. Barker was 14, and the timing carried a particular cruelty. It happened the day before he was set to start high school. He has recalled riding his bike to the hospital separately from the rest of his family and understanding, the moment he saw everyone's faces, that something irreversible had happened. What Barker has said publicly is that his mother's parting words to him were simple and direct, essentially, to keep playing the drums and to follow his dreams no matter what. Grief has a way of either derailing people or giving them a fixed point to steer toward, and for Barker, it became the latter. At Fontana High School, he threw himself into the marching band's drumline and the jazz ensemble, soaking up military precision rhythms on one hand and jazz phrasing on the other, while his own musical taste was pulling him toward hip-hop and punk. His mother's death didn't just leave him with grief, it welded his identity to an instrument in a way that would define the rest of his life. There's a second thread running quietly underneath all of this, one that wouldn't fully reveal its significance for almost 2 more decades. Even as a teenager, long before he had any real-world reason to fear it, Barker developed an intense fear of flying. He's described being convinced, from a young age, that a plane crash would be how he died. It followed him into adulthood and into fame. When Blink-182 designed the cover art for their 2001 album Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, each band member was assigned a symbol. Mark Hoppus got the jacket, Tom DeLonge got the pants, and Barker was handed an airplane. By his own account, he asked the band not to give him that particular symbol because his fear of flying was already well known among people close to him. He got the airplane anyway. At the time, it was just an ironic bit of album art, a joke about an anxiety Barker considered irrational. 7 years later, none of it would feel like a joke anymore. On the night of September 19, 2008, Barker and DJ AM, the celebrity DJ and producer Adam Goldstein, had just finished a concert together in Columbia, South Carolina, performing under the name TRV DJ AM. They boarded a chartered Learjet 60, operated by Global Exec Aviation, headed for Van Nuys Airport in California. Also on the plane were Barker's assistant, Chris Baker, his security guard, Charles Che Still, and the flight's two-person crew, Captain Sarah Lemon and First Officer James Bland. 6 people total, on what should have been a routine red-eye home after a show. According to the National Transportation Safety Board's final accident report, released in 2010 after an extensive investigation, the Learjet began its takeoff roll on runway 11 at Columbia Metropolitan Airport just before midnight. As the aircraft accelerated, its occupants heard a loud bang, and air traffic controllers on the ground reported seeing sparks coming from the plane. The crew believed a tire had blown and made the decision to abort the takeoff, but by that point, the aircraft was traveling at roughly 144 knots, beyond the V1 decision speed of 136 knots at which a safe rejected takeoff is no longer guaranteed to work. The NTSB's investigation found that the disaster wasn't the result of one single failure, but a chain of them. The board determined the probable cause to be the operator's inadequate maintenance of the aircraft's tires, which had become severely underinflated and burst during the takeoff roll, combined with the captain's decision to reject the takeoff after the plane had already passed V1, a decision inconsistent with her training. Debris from the exploding tires also damaged the plane's hydraulic system, crippling its brakes, while an automatic safety feature caused the thrust reversers to stow themselves mid-abort, robbing the crew of one more tool that might have helped slow the aircraft down. In other words, this wasn't simply a tire blew and the plane crashed. It was maintenance failure, mechanical design, and a split-second human decision, all converging in the worst possible sequence. Unable to stop, the Learjet overran the end of the runway, tore through the airport's perimeter fence, crossed a nearby highway, and slammed into an embankment, where it burst into flames. Airport firefighters spent more than an hour battling the wreckage. 4 of the 6 people aboard never made it out. Chris Baker and Che Still died in the crash itself, while Captain Lemon and First Officer Bland died from a combination of burns and smoke inhalation in the minutes that followed. Barker and Goldstein were the only survivors. What happened next is almost too harrowing to summarize cleanly. Barker has described realizing the cabin was on fire, grabbing Goldstein, who had been asleep and was woken by Barker's screaming, and jumping from the burning aircraft, only to land in a pool of spilled jet fuel. His body caught fire almost instantly. Witnesses and first responders described watching both men run from the wreckage while engulfed in flames, tearing at their own burning clothing. Someone on the ground eventually shouted for Barker to stop, drop, and roll. When he did, Goldstein, despite his own severe burns, used his body and clothing to help smother the flames still consuming Barker's legs and feet. The physical toll was staggering. Barker suffered third-degree burns across roughly 65% of his body, along with multiple fractures. He was airlifted to the Joseph M. Still Burn Center in Augusta, Georgia, where he remained hospitalized for weeks, undergoing dozens of surgeries and repeated skin grafting procedures. Reporting from the time, including coverage from CBS News and the Associated Press, documented both survivors' extended hospitalizations and the eventual legal settlements Barker and the victims' families reached with the charter company, the plane's owner, Learjet, and the tire manufacturer, Goodyear. The physical wounds were only part of it. In a 2015 interview with ABC News, Barker admitted that the pain during his recovery became so unbearable that hospital staff eventually confiscated his phone because he had been calling friends and offering them money to end his suffering for him. He has described that period, trapped in a hospital bed, unable to control even the most basic functions of his own body after a lifetime of staying busy and taking care of everyone around him, as the most psychologically devastating stretch of his life. If there was one thing that made the aftermath bearable at all, it was that Barker wasn't the only person who understood exactly what had happened inside that fire. Adam Goldstein had been there beside him, had helped save his life, in fact, at real risk to his own. The 2 men, already close friends and musical collaborators, became something more like each other's support system as they recovered in parallel, comparing notes on skin grafts, on the psychological aftershocks of nearly dying together, on what it meant to keep functioning in public while carrying that kind of trauma. Barker has described them, in interviews since, as essentially having been each other's therapists in that first stretch of recovery. Goldstein's recovery had its own complications. He had been sober for roughly a decade after previously battling addiction, and, acutely aware of how dangerous pain medication can be for someone in recovery, he reportedly hired a nurse specifically to manage and administer his prescriptions rather than handle them himself. He underwent his own skin grafts and spent time in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber to speed healing. But trauma doesn't always respond to discipline. People close to him described him growing visibly anxious around fire and pyrotechnics during DJ sets in the months that followed, to the point that at least one Las Vegas nightclub residency reportedly scaled back its flame effects around his performances. 3 months after the crash, Goldstein filed a lawsuit against the charter company, the pilot's estates, and other parties, citing the physical pain, disfigurement, and psychological distress the accident had caused him. Then, less than a year after the crash, on August 28, 2009, Goldstein was found dead in his New York apartment after friends grew concerned they couldn't reach him ahead of a scheduled trip to Las Vegas. He was 36. The New York City medical examiner ruled his death an accidental overdose involving a combination of prescription drugs, including a benzodiazepine and cocaine. It was not classified as an intentional act, but the timing, just weeks before what would have been the first anniversary of the crash, led many people close to the situation, along with addiction specialists commenting publicly at the time, to wonder aloud whether the unresolved trauma of surviving that fire had played some role in his relapse. For Barker, the loss compounded an already unbearable equation. 4 people had died in the crash itself, and now the one other person who had walked through that fire with him, the person who didn't need anything explained to him, was gone too. Barker has spoken about the specific cruelty of losing, in his words, one of his closest friends, someone who had just survived a plane crash with him, only to lose him to something else entirely less than a year later. By his own description, that second loss pushed an already severe case of survivor's guilt into something darker. Barker has said he became genuinely convinced for a period that he was going to die too, that his number was simply up next. He's spoken about quietly relocating from his tour bus to hotels without letting people track his movements, driven by a real fear that something was coming for him. Underneath that fear was something else Barker has only more recently discussed at length. His lifelong terror of flying had already, before the crash even happened, fed into a developing dependency on medication. In interviews tied to his 2026 documentary Travis Barker, Louder Than Fear, he's explained that friends initially gave him pills to take the edge off before flights, and that what started as 1 or 2 pills before a trip eventually became something he felt he couldn't function without. Barker has said that at the peak of his addiction he was taking as many as 20 to 30 pills a day, a detail his former wife, Shauna Moakler, has said left her genuinely stunned when she first learned the extent of it. He's described, in the same interviews, having a security guard at one point whose job specifically included checking that he was still breathing. For over a decade after the crash, Barker did not get back on a plane. He rebuilt his career on the ground instead, touring by bus, recording, staying visible in music without ever fully confronting the fear that had nearly killed him. That changed in August 2021, when Kourtney Kardashian accompanied him on a private flight from California to Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. At 45 years old, Barker flew for the first time since the crash. He has repeatedly credited Kardashian with helping him work through a fear that had shaped over a decade of his professional and personal decisions. By 2023, he had logged roughly 30 flights since that first trip and has said publicly that without her support, he doesn't believe he could tour, or simply enjoy life, the way he does now. Barker and Kardashian married in 2022. Their path to having a child together wasn't smooth. The couple has spoken publicly about experiencing a miscarriage and multiple rounds of unsuccessful IVF before conceiving their son. In September 2023, while Barker was on tour in Europe, doctors discovered a serious complication with the pregnancy that required Kardashian to undergo urgent fetal surgery. Barker left the tour and flew back to be with her. The procedure was successful, and their son, Rocky 13 Barker, was born on November 1, 2023. By any reasonable external measure, that's a story with a happy ending bolted onto it. The fear conquered, the family built, the career intact. But Travis Barker, Louder Than Fear, the documentary that premiered in August 2026, reportedly filmed intermittently over roughly a decade, exists precisely because Barker himself doesn't experience his life that neatly. The film sits his mother's death, his lifelong fear of flying, his struggle with addiction, the crash itself, and Goldstein's death side by side, refusing to let them be treated as separate, resolved chapters. And in the run-up to the documentary's release, Barker revealed a detail about that night that had gone largely unspoken for nearly 18 years. In an August 10, 2026 appearance on the On Purpose with Jay Shetty podcast, Barker recalled that in the days before the flight, he had actually asked his manager whether it was too late to cancel the South Carolina show altogether. He was, in his words, perfectly content staying home with his kids. His manager told him it was too late to pull out. Then, on the day he left for the show, Barker recalled saying goodbye to his young daughter Alabama, who was around 2 or 3 years old at the time. Unlike her usual self, she became inconsolable, crying and repeatedly telling him, "Dad, don't go." Then, according to Barker, she said something that made no sense to him in the moment, "The roof's gonna come off." He said he was already uneasy about the trip himself. Uneasy enough that, after finally boarding, he called his own father and told him to make sure the kids were taken care of if anything happened to him. Hours later, the Learjet crashed on takeoff. It's the kind of detail that doesn't change any of the facts of what happened. The NTSB's findings about tire maintenance and pilot decision-making stand regardless, but it adds a haunting emotional footnote to a story Barker has now spent years trying to fully process in public. As he's put it himself, understanding just how close he came to not surviving that night has left him with a sense of gratitude for being alive that he says he genuinely struggles to put into words. So here is Travis Barker at 50, still drumming, still touring with Blink, 182, married, a father again, decades removed from a mother he lost as a teenager and nearly 2 decades removed from a fire that should have killed him. On paper, it reads like a triumph, the survivor who rebuilt everything. But Barker's own account of his life resists that framing, and it's worth taking him at his word rather than flattening the story into an inspirational headline. He lost his mother before he was old enough to fully process grief, and the drums became both his coping mechanism and his identity because of it. He developed a fear of flying he couldn't explain until it explained itself in the worst possible way. He survived a crash that killed 4 people who happened to be in the wrong seats on the wrong plane. He watched, less than a year later, as the one other person who understood exactly what that night felt like died anyway, in a different kind of accident entirely. He battled an addiction that had its roots in trying to manage a fear that turned out to be prophetic. And even now, with a family, a career, and 13 years of hard-won distance from that night, he still carries all of it, not as background trivia for a documentary trailer, but as the actual architecture of who he is. That's the tragedy underneath the headlines about Travis Barker at 50. It isn't that he failed to recover. He did recover, by almost any measure anyone could ask of him. The tragedy is that recovery was never going to mean forgetting, and it was never going to erase the fact that he is the one who walked away from that burning runway while 4 other people, including his closest surviving witness to it all, did not. Barker has built an entire life in the space that loss carved out. He just never stopped carrying the people who couldn't build one alongside him.